The main theme of Silent Hill 1 begins with a rough, almost abrasive guitar strum, a loud energy reduced to a tremolo before slipping into a melancholic melody. A sound that captures both the authenticity of memory, that of when the town was lived in, and the weight of a history buried beneath the fog. It feels like the essence of a town that once breathed and thrived, now swallowed by mist and haunted by visions of the occult. The same leitmotif reappeared yesterday on the 25th of September 2025 in Konami's first Silent Hill game to come out of Japan in the last 2 decades. It resurfaces in Silent Hill F's theme in a deliberate callback to the beginning. On one hand, it's a beautiful gesture, remembering the beginning of everything, of where all the journeys began, the place of birth, a way to musically stitching this prequel into this franchise's DNA, tying the first Silent Hill chronologically to the very beginning of the series sound. But it's also here I feel like the first of many problems with the new game Silent Hill F arises. The reuse of the motif is practically meaningless in this instance. It's merely there to signify its ties to the rest of the series, because not only story-wise, but everything around this game feels not like a Silent Hill game. The use of the motif is but an echo of the original's cult entanglement and aesthetic signifiers, but stripped of the deeper psychological resonance that made the original work. Where the first game's music reflected a town suffocating under its occult past, abandoned and empty, here the music gestures toward Silent Hill without yet being Silent Hill. So how can it be? How can the town of Silent Hill not exist in the mythos of its own universe? A universe rid of that identity, stripped naked of the town. Can it still be a Silent Hill game? What actually makes a Silent Hill game feel like Silent Hill? For me personally, it's not just fog or cults or the grotesque monsters. It's the interplay between the atmosphere, exploration and metaphor, that the way each game plays with this exploration of the liminal and the abstract utilizes its own unique atmosphere to serve a mythological sense of belonging, thing derived as well from the limited gameplay tools the game offers. Harry's search for his daughter through Silent Hill's snowy environments which rapidly shift. James's search for his late wife on Silent Hill's 2 foggy streets. The opening dungeon, the apartments, feel like suffocating cages of grief and despair, melded together by the dress of her memory. Silent Hill 3's mall shifted from consumerist banality of one's summer afternoon to the grotesque otherworld as the town of Silent Hill holds its grips on Heather, trying to drag her closer to its core. Even Silent Hill 4 weaponized its repetition, the claustrophobia of Henry's apartment window, into an externalized form of isolation, as his experiences of the hall held all of the dreams of the residents of the building. Against that lineage, Silent Hill F dares to open with a nod to history, a history not yet established, and something it quickly forgets, choosing to pivot into something else, a game that looks like Silent Hill on the surface but carries a very different heart. This is a critique of Silent Hill F written by someone who loves the series deeply and wants to explore what this new entry does both right and wrong. I'll be analyzing everything from its story and gameplay systems to its atmosphere and soundtrack. I recognize that opinions on this game are highly divisive, and my goal here is to communicate my perspective in a way that is both thoughtful and respectful. I also encourage those who have not played the game to go ahead and do so if they want to remain unspoiled. Spoiler markers will appear past the gameplay discussion, clearly indicating any plot relevant detail not shown in the opening 20 minutes. Let us begin. After hitting the start button, we get a cutscene of a memory from the main character's childhood. We see Hinako as a child, confiding in her doll, that none of the other girls want to play house with her. She vows not to play with dolls anymore. A small but telling rejection and foreshadowing of the game's themes of abandonment and denial, which I'll return to later. The scene then cuts to the present. Hinako embraces her older sister before the title drops, only for that warmth to dissolve into the reality of her dysfunctional home. She argues with her parents, the silhouettes on the walls, foretelling of the strange journey that's about to unfold. She calls out her father and leaves the house out of anger. The introduction sets the tone for the game's overall tone, both domestic and unstable, that of the fall of the traditional family values and convenient archetypal roles. Before the game even shows us its combat systems or atmospheric tricks, it makes clear that Hinako's world is already fractured due to her abusive family life. This fracture is one that is carried right from her childhood vow all the way until present time. After the family scene, the game takes us out of the home and into Hinako's walk down the mountain to meet with her friends, to discuss what had happened at home. What stands out here is the lack of Silent Hill's traditional marks. The fog is almost non-existent. Clear but overcast skies with tiny gaps in the clouds fill the sky that's pressing down on the town below. The iconic fog of the series doesn't arrive until much later, when the fabric of the story shatters. For now we have peace. Light shatters the volumetric particles, and as you descend into town it grows deeper and angrier, covering more and more of your vision. On the descent, I felt so much attention was placed on the details of the traditional Japanese town, rendered with striking historical care. Small huts, wooden shrines, and folk statues signal the spiritual backbone of this place. The Inari Okami, or the fox god, is what the villagers of this region worship. Everyday details complete the picture, with bikes tied against fences, clothes hung out on wires, bottles of beer in corners, and even magazines with glossy covers explaining what it means to be womanly. These textures of daily life anchor the narrative in the 1960s and help make the otherwise devoid space appear as a lived-in, real place. What's clever here, I feel like, is how the game uses environment to mix its themes into the narrative. The folk statues show the pull of tradition and worship. The magazines imply toward modern ideals of gender, of the perfect woman. The beer bottles scattered around hint at escapism of the fractured adult life without a single line of dialogue. The town feels at once ordinary and uneasy, a place where Hinako's personal story can play out against both the spiritual backdrop and the social pressure expected from her. During her descent down the mountain, no music plays. Yamaoka's compositions remain absent for now, as the focus here is on the natural side being invaded by that of humanity. This lack of music shifts our attention to the texture of the environment itself and makes the beginning feel grounded within a regular Japanese town. In town, a truck seems to be blocking the way, and when Hinako approaches it, she notices a dead crow, a bad omen that sets the mood for the events following. Passing by the window, we overhear a conversation between some villagers that seem to be discussing someone's death, which they speculate might have been the result of a curse. A detail which sets up the recurring patterns that will later become central to the story in New Game Plus, where the same conversation shifts meaning entirely. It also sets up a mystery as to who might have died in the first place. Going down the street near a house, we meet up with one of Hinako's friends, Sakuko, who's hanging around at the window. Sakuko is a cheerful but deeply spiritual girl, as described by the game's journal, and this is the first time things start feeling off. The two of them discuss to meet up, but one thing which is strange about this interaction is the fact that Sakuko calls Hinako a traitor on two occasions, right at the beginning of the conversation and right at the end. The second time it feels much more unsettling than the first. As we go down the street, we also find a missing poster detailing that a person by the name of Suzutami Mayumi has disappeared. The poster appears to be ripped. We walk forwards and eventually meet up with Hinako's friends in front of Chizoruya General Store. The cast here is small and quite stereotyped if you're familiar with anime tropes in general. Sakuko, the religious and spiritually inclined girl, Shu, Hinako's childhood friend and the axis of a subtle rivalry, and Rinko, the jealous, sharp-edged girl who clearly harbors feelings for Shu. The chemistry between them is fragile and appears to be so close to non-existent that it makes you wonder if there was any there in the first place. In particular, Shu's nonchalant behavior and total absence in caring about how Hinako feels, and Rinko's outright hatred and spite she harbors for Hinako feel antithetical to the idea of a friend. The conversation turns playful as the main cast banter with almost zero chemistry between each other. Eventually, Hinako loses her focus for a bit, And when she starts paying attention again, Sakuko tries to call her a traitor but gets overtaken by a strange red glow and killed. Sakuko is also an interesting case because she seems to see something the others don't. Her strange insistence on calling Hinako a traitor, both when they first speak and as their conversation ends, as well as right before she gets killed, here feels odd. The term is loaded, but the game doesn't explain it yet. Not really ever. But it does help plant the first seeds of suspicion that Hinako's relationships aren't what they seem. It's only here upon the first death that the series' trademark fog makes its appearance. Until now the mist has been a faint presence, but with Sakuko's death a fog monster appears covering the town in gloom and fog. The deeper Hinako steps away from her strained social ties, the more the town itself turns opaque. What had been an overcast day in a sleepy town is suddenly suffused with horror, mostly red flowers and bulging flesh. The atmosphere transforms from a realistic melancholy to unmistakable dread. The others scatter in panic, leaving Hinako alone, pursued and almost swallowed by the thing that's chasing her. In this running section you must get past a bunch of obstacles, narrow corridors, sharp turns, and the oppressive fog forces you into quick reaction in order not to receive a game over, which in itself becomes the point. At the end of the chase, Hinako stumbles into a dead end, and the voice of her sister tells her to not give up. A ladder is lowered into the alleyway, yet when Hinako looks, there's no one there. Jumping off the roof, Hinako lands in an alleyway and the game finally opens up a little, allowing you to experience some of the combat, explore and start using healing items. Here we get a message from Shu telling us he prepared some special pills for us that will help alleviate our headaches and heal both sanity and health, mechanics that I'll both go into later. After we heal up and start going into town deeper, these first areas, the opening waterway canal and the walkable streets, not yet blocked off, immediately evoke the familiar Silent Hill exploration we've grown accustomed to. The atmosphere here is oppressive yet believable and rather grounded, although this might stem from the photorealistic art style, which does lend the place a more believable appearance. It is unsettling but rather mundane, in a way that feels strange. If things like the mountain town of Silent Hill in the original series made the fog feel out of place, almost alien to its surroundings, here it seems to evoke a sense of belonging. It's natural, as though it belongs to this 1960s Japanese town. Turning it away from an object of strangeness and instead using other elements in tandem with it to transform the atmosphere into an uneasy familiar one. Abandoned streets, quiet canals and small shrines give the impression of a living town that's suddenly been emptied, punctuated by signs of ordinary life, bicycles chained to fences, laundry hanging on wires and beer bottles scattered near corners. Even advertisements add to this period texture. A real man beer poster featuring a pretty woman holding a glass contrasts oddly against the silent emptiness, highlighting the social context of the era. Even books you come across seem to reinforce the same traditional values. A variety of articles about being a good wife and a wise mother can be found within the houses of the town. These first 30 minutes or so of gameplay offer quite meaningful and hefty exploration. The streets, shrines and canals feel lived in, and the way the environment opens up just enough to look around encourages curiosity. Unfortunately, the area is rather small, and every time you turn a corner and are excited about a branching path, it ends before it even gets somewhere. This problem only gets aggravated later on in the game, as most sections become extremely linear and try to funnel you straight from one objective to the next. Even in this short span we get to spend here, the tension feels palpable. Tight alleyways and claustrophobic spaces prevent you from running past monsters like you would do in previous games, making combat unavoidable, but ultimately not annoying yet, as you aren't forced into combat scenarios which aren't 1v1s. As you turn the corner past a small alley near the place where you pick up the metal pipe, the game's first weapon, the first enemy appears from behind a corner and instantly tries grabbing you. Its design is that of a stitched-together woman, her body marred with jagged cuts and grotesque stitchings. As she approaches, the game starts playing a distorted version of the classic Silent Hill 1 radio static, even though Hinako doesn't carry a radio. This cue plays for all enemies in the game, yet for some reason they didn't give Hinako a physical radio. At first I thought maybe they weren't invented yet, but no, that isn't the case. It seems intentional. This is especially strange considering that radios were already being mass-produced by Sony in Japan as early as 1957, and there's no apparent reason why Hinako couldn't have found or had a portable radio to indicate the monster's presence. There are full-on radios scattered across the map, but they play audio cues of what happened in the area, and aren't used to determine when a monster is nearby. My point is that why bother implementing the sound and tying it to the radio if you're not even going to have a radio? At least in Silent Hill 4, when they decided to not give Henry a radio, no static played when the enemies were nearby. This is just a minor nitpick, but to me this sense of inconsistency feels strange and persists throughout the entire game with other details as well. This first encounter also serves as a tutorial in all but name, introducing the core systems that will govern combat throughout the game. Hinako has 3 main bars to manage: health represented by the red bar, stamina shown in green, and sanity indicated by a bar full of flowers. Swinging the metal pipe with heavy or light attacks drains stamina, as does dodging. The focus mechanic is something rather unique to this game. Holding a trigger slows time when an enemy telegraphs an attack, allowing Hinako to counter and, if fully charged, deliver a double damage strike. But overusing focus drains sanity, leaving her vulnerable not only to physical attacks but to psychological assaults as well, which drains max sanity until an item is used, or it's reset at a save point by using a currency called Fate, a mechanic which I'll discuss more in detail when I get to it. Returning to the encounter itself, it happens in an alleyway and its tightness emphasizes these systems. There's no room to run past the enemy, forcing you to engage with both stamina and focus. This section is made to get the player somewhat familiar with systems and to teach them both restraint and timing, how to balance attacking, dodging, and preserving mental composure. The limited melee weapon durability is another system that gets added upon this, and also comes as a surprise since it hadn't been done since Silent Hill Origins, well, if you don't count Downpour. Hinako can carry only 3 melee weapons at a time, and unlike Origins, you're limited to a very specific handful: pipes, crowbars, bats, hammers that break after relatively little use. The system theoretically encourages variety, but in practice you'll usually just end up sticking with 2 high durability, low damage weapons and 1 high damage, low durability one that slots in the 3 slots you have for the entire game. Toolboxes exist to patch weapons, but using them on anything that isn't the knife or the axe is simply a waste. So what I ended up doing in my playthrough was pouring all of my toolboxes into whatever high damage weapon I had at the time to keep it serviceable, while holding the steel pipe and 1 other random as backup. Because replacements are plentiful, weapons breaking rarely create real scarcity, and you never really seem to run out even on the hard combat difficulty. These durability decisions as such rarely force meaningful inventory choices. It all boils down to dropping the lowest value weapon when you find something marginally better and moving on. That design choice removes tension from the supposed trade-off and turns this intended strategic loop into a predictable habit that never really gets improved by any means, until the point the game just decides to throw it out the window. The durability system itself feels half-assed in, so much so that the game itself throws it out the window on multiple occasions. In the Nightmare World sequences, the game just hands you 2 weapons with infinite durability and expects you to use them for every fight. Instead of designing these areas around at least the same basis as the Fog World, scarcity or the management aspect of survival horror is not even on their mind here. Since these are the most controlled instances in the game and they forcefully take your weapons away in them, I would have at least liked to see them implement scarcity here and desensitize fighting, but no such thing is done. Instead of spreading weapons more evenly or encouraging more traditional combat, these areas give you unbreakable weapons and add respawning enemies to top it all off, which force the player to tediously knock down the enemies to disable them for a bit before exploring more around. Outside of those sequences, durability still doesn't create any real pressure because weapons are so abundant. The game constantly forces you into combat scenarios, and in doing so, it requires the level designers to shower you with replacements because otherwise you'd have the chance to get softlocked in a combat arena, making it nearly impossible to ever run out. As a result, you end up cycling through weapons without thinking much most of the time. Even stranger, in the second half of the game the system gets dropped altogether and replaced with something else entirely, which I'll get into later when we get to the more spoilery part of the video. The result is a loop that never feels consistent. The game outright tells you durability is a core survival mechanic, but it treats it like it's barely even there. At best, the system feels half-baked, and if you believed the other systems in the game would be treated any differently, you'd unfortunately be wrong. The game's resource management also suffers from severe problems which expose just how shaky the mechanical foundation for its quote-unquote survival mechanics really are. Hinako begins with, I think, 7 or 8 inventory slots that are separated from weapon slots and can be filled with healing items, sanity restoratives, stamina boosters or toolboxes for weapon repair. In theory, this limited space should force hard choices. What do you keep, what do you sacrifice, and how do you prepare for the unknown? In practice though, the loop collapses almost immediately on itself due to a variety of baffling choices. Most of these problems arise as early as the way the offering type items work. Items like antique combs or dried carcasses aren't useful in combat at all, and all they do is clog up inventory space unless they're carried to a save point and sacrificed in exchange for fate, which functions as the game's upgrade currency. Fate itself ties directly into the skill tree system. It's a currency which allows the player to upgrade health, stamina, sanity, unlock additional slots for equipable charms. These charms are called omamoris and function much like Dark Souls rings, offering small buffs that occupy one of your available slots. They can be obtained either through random exploration or by spending fate in a gacha style system which will reward you with a random one. Fate can also be spent to restore sanity at save points, but the overall structure of the game renders much of this redundant. Sanity management is trivialized by the abundance of healing types which not only heal but give back sanity or instantly restore it to full. And leveling up sanity only mildly affects encounters since there's no reason to hold the button unless an enemy is about to hit a counterable attack or you're charging up a 2x. The skill tree feels completely out of place in a game trying to evoke survival horror, and it actively undermines the game's balance. Bosses feel artificially punishing only if you haven't been putting your points into health early on, but there's little reason to upgrade stats like sanity since most fights can be trivialized without even needing to hold focus more than a few seconds. Stamina likewise matters less because the only time you find yourself spamming the bar to depletion is during boss fights, where it can be patched up with restorative items, including one that grants effectively infinite stamina, one of the most overpowered items in the game. Stamina still feels like the second most important stat and probably the only one worth upgrading after HP. The inventory management as such gets compounded by the upgrade system and the issues keep piling up back to back, all originating from the offering system. Since offerings take up precious inventory space, you're incentivized to immediately run back and deposit them before they clog your bag. The game punishes dropping items outright by deleting them, so the optimal playstyle becomes a tedious loop of running back, sacrificing the offerings, running forward and repeating for the remainder of the game. And if you're like me and thought the game was going to cut the amount of items it gives you at one point, you'd have ended up playing this way throughout the entire thing, resulting in a gameplay experience that feels like it comes to a standstill every single time you find one of these items, at least until you get a proper amount of slots from upgrades. Still, this always felt like less of an inconvenience in which I was managing my resources and more like an annoyance I was forced to deal with. The problem isn't that the system itself is inherently hard. The game bombards you with so many resources that there were only 2 points in my playthrough where I genuinely felt like I've mismanaged my resources, and that was when I was playing on the hard difficulty. I don't want to imagine how the story difficulty feels if this hard mode doesn't even force me into rationing my resources properly. The whole combat and resource management feel like systems designed around 1v1 or 1v2's maximum scenarios, but the game constantly forces you into fights with 3 or more enemies, often in cramped corridors. Not only that, actually taking them on usually isn't fun and it isn't particularly frightening, but it also just ends up being annoying. Time and time again, the game locks you into combat arenas you have no way of escaping until you take out every single enemy. Something which feels totally antithetical to the other Silent Hill games, which mostly stuck to 1 or 2 enemies at a time. Combat also grows repetitive once you realize you can simply hold the focus button and wait for the enemy to telegraph attacks to counter, which becomes especially necessary since your basic attacks do jack shit even on the story difficulty. But on hard, you take absurd amounts of damage from even a few of the basic enemy's attacks, so the commitment isn't even worth it. This, however, doesn't even matter, as in practice your weapon's collision is terrible and most of the times doesn't connect if there's a wall even slightly touching it. The game also likes pulling off cheap tricks like hiding enemies on ceilings and walls to surprise the player. In practice, this ends up with you simply taking undeserved damage from exploring the game's crammed environments. Sometimes checking the corners is impossible, and as a result it never ends up feeling fair, not even in the late game when you have more tools at your disposal. Even worse, the game's difficulty during combat seems to stem from either ganking the player with multiple enemies at once and overwhelming them, or stunning them repeatedly. Multiple enemies can shriek, stun, or grab you, sometimes without clear telegraphs, which turns combat into a frustrating mess where control is taken away from you constantly, and you end up unable to move in some scenarios right until you are dead, without ever getting to touch your controller. The grab, in my opinion, is one of the worst things by far. It locks you into an animation that detects if your health is below 50% and instantly kills you if that condition is met. Not only that, but for some enemies the telegraph is just a few frames long. The default mannequin enemies sometimes initiate it so close to you that there is no way to dodge it unless you have your stamina bar full. Another thing that can happen out of this grab is that you can get repeatedly pounced by a certain enemy type and stun locked into it until you are dead. Thing which happened about twice in my playthrough, but I still think it's worth mentioning. As you move deeper into town and through the game, combat begins to scale naturally with the environments, and the game keeps adding more and more enemies. The alleyways open into slightly wider streets, canals, and small courtyards, but the space is still tight enough to make encounters feel claustrophobic. Enemy density increases, introducing multiple threats at once. The stitched together women attack in groups of 2, and later on it can get as absurd as around 4 enemies at once. And to add insult to injury, most of the time you aren't given the option to avoid a fight at all, stripping away much of the survival horror tension the series is known for. Corridors and walking areas are designed to be so tight you can't even properly run past these enemies, forcing you into these combat scenarios which would have otherwise been avoidable in the other games. I've seen people mention on social media how you can walk past enemies in tight areas by standing completely still, but that's not even possible in most encounters, especially when enemies are blocking valuable items you may need. It's also not remotely interesting as a survival horror mechanic, requiring the player to stop at a standstill and not move at all while waiting for the slow-moving enemies to pass. If you're someone who thinks that Silent Hill 2 Remake somehow fixed the combat of the old games, then you might enjoy this. I personally feel like the cinematic combat stands against what Silent Hill means. While I personally don't feel like the system itself is the worst in this instance, it feels clearly misused, forcing ganking scenarios before you even get the ability to fight groups of monsters more easily. The lock-on system also doesn't make the character automatically face the direction of the monster, instead allows you to run backwards for some reason, which results in stilted moments in combat where you're mashing left and right, trying to get the character to face the way you actually want it to go, and sometimes taking accidental damage. Combat feels like a fresh take on the series, but it is extremely lackluster in multiple places. One of the ways most apparent past its mechanical incompatibility is present in the horror aspect. In previous games, although there was only one button to hold for attacking, at times you could get swarmed or had to turn a certain way quickly, switch to pistol, and the moment you were locked into combat there wasn't really a moment of pause, wait, think, act. You either ran away or fought, and at most checked your health or healed or reloaded. There was never a moment to pause, analyze and spam buttons during most encounters. The threats felt imposing because oftentimes there was little time to react to them, and you usually trade health with the monster. The decision making came from choosing which weapon to take it down, or if to even take it down at all. Here it requires the player to concentrate on parrying and dodging the enemy attacks so much that it loses the scare factor faster than ever. This is especially apparent when it comes to utilizing the resources you have while wrestling with it. It forces combat so often that at points it all becomes repetitive. Hold one button, wait for the enemy to attack, dodge a little, rinse and repeat 6 or 7 times in a row. The reason this feels so wrong in the first place is because it is an action system. Everything from the lock-on to the way you swing, dodge and balance your stats dictates it to be one. And while not necessarily being a bad thing, it is not a thing indicative of the Silent Hill franchise. By the time you are 10 hours in, you feel like you've been forever in the game. The combat is a pushover on story difficulty, but surprisingly annoying on hard. Especially in those later game sections where you are locked to tight corridors and forced to fight enemies that can stun and kill you in 2 hits. This is how the game plays for most of its runtimes. Run around, fight monsters, story beat, run around, fight monsters, story beat. My main issue comes from the fact this really doesn't feel like a Silent Hill game. The amount of puzzles in the game barely amounts to a fraction of what any of the other games in the series have had, and the amount of exploring you do is basically limited to the first hour of the game. After that, the game turns into a linear run to each mark on the map. People complain about invisible walls in other games. This one is far worse. Roads are blocked by trucks you could easily squeeze past or fields you could obviously walk across, but the game says no. You're forced to take ridiculous detours. Enemies can roam freely through fields, but you're stuck tiptoeing along narrow paths, even getting stopped by a random hay bale. Sometimes the game marks something on the map as blocked off and later on unblocks it inexplicably. It only does it once, but it's one of the only moments in the game I've genuinely felt confused in. At least you get to do the exploration in the buildings, right? Like the school in Silent Hill 1 or the apartment in Silent Hill 2. There's areas like that, right? Well, yes, but not really. There are only about 2 or 3 proper buildings in the entire game. Small houses are scattered across town, but most have just 1 or 2 rooms that you can finish exploring in about 30 seconds. There are only about 3 of these. The rest of the dungeon-style exploration occurs in the other world, or in the 2 main dungeons, the middle school and Hinako's house. The other world does introduce puzzles each time you enter, but most of them are trivial, like pulling a few levers to align color-coded doors. Even then, these areas you explore barely make up a fraction of the story or the environments you would have otherwise seen in previous games, and they remain heavily combat-focused, with most boss fights and tougher arenas taking place in here. The zones feel far too short, and most puzzles get reduced to simple fetch quests. Go to a point on the map, pick up an item and return it to where you were told to place it. None of the long dark corridors or traditionally fitted Japanese areas ever feel like fully realized spaces. I do however like their atmosphere, with it feeling very similar to the docks area in Yumeniki, with the traditional boardwalk commonly featured over lakes in traditional Japanese Zen gardens and its old-fashioned pond lanterns, although the area itself isn't very interesting mechanically. The best area by far is the school, which feels the most like classic Silent Hill, alongside the dungeon near the end that takes place in Hinako's home. The problem with the latter is that it's totally linear, and by just running through every room once, you finish it before it even begins getting interesting. The school area has a very nice variety of great puzzles and feels mostly like the traditional Silent Hill formula. And if the game had gone the route of making more buildings akin to this one, I feel like it would have turned the experience into a better Silent Hill game overall. Still, the fact I can count the puzzles on one hand should be an indicator of something going really wrong during the development process of this game. I feel like having a game like this focus on combat is a mistake and makes the main gameplay loop feel off kilter. It's not that the combat system on its own is inherently bad or broken on its own. In a different title, it maybe might have had room to expand in directions better suited for the action-driven design it features, but because this is a Silent Hill game primarily, a series whose focus has never been on the combat, it feels completely out of place. As long as it wears the Silent Hill name, this style of combat can never feel at home. This fact could have been somewhat relieved if the combat itself was more often broken up by puzzles or meaningful exploration, but as it stands, it remains one of many lackluster additions. So, the game doesn't feel that great, but as you get upgrades and the game progresses, it must get better, right? Well, yes, but actually not really. It becomes strange. The game features a variety of mandatory boss fights which attempt to employ the heavy combat system and utilize it to its fullest. This falls flat by having the difficulty of the game itself artificially inflated by either terrible hitboxes or by having bosses with an absurd number of phases and terrible damage scaling compared to your puny health bar near the start of the game. Some of the bosses even execute combos that go as long as 6-7 hits, with your stamina bar quickly running out of dodges before their attack even finishes, even if it was full at the start of the attack animation. However, I'd argue that the bosses are by far the most fun I've had with the combat system out of the entire game, and are generally the place where combat shines the most, since it's given enough space for attacks to properly land without colliding. You have enough space for dodging and telegraphs, which turns these fights into quite challenging and interesting gameplay scenarios. There's a bit left to criticize of the combat system, however this is the point where the video begins entering heavy spoiler territory. This is your last warning to turn back, if you still haven't played the game and still want to give it a go. Leaving the bosses aside near the end of the game due to story related reasons, Hinako gets a fox arm that first replaces your Nightmare World weapons and eventually wipes out the real world arsenal as well. I mention this because the game shifts further in direction when the arm gets introduced. It not only trivializes combat entirely, but it also destroys any of the atmosphere and suspense that was left. It actively erases any sense of atmosphere or vulnerability that these games are known for, in order to provide a gameplay loop that, again, in practice doesn't feel satisfying at all. The system simply swings the game even heavier towards its action-oriented nature. It allows the player to turn on a sort of devil trigger, devil may cry like mechanic, where you become invincible and are able to whip the floor with enemies, being able to quickly jump from one to the other. On top of that, the default arm form has charged attacks which provide massive damage and can easily be spammed to close to no stamina or sanity cost. Thematically speaking, on one hand, you don't want to ignore that the game explicitly frames this arc of gaining the arm as part of the larger plot, but it's also the point where the game to me completely fell apart, as the gameplay essentially turned into the heaviest combat arenas where you perform combos and essentially style on the visual representations of Hinako's repressed fears of being touched by men or of pregnancy. I feel like the transformation itself as well isn't indicative of a psychological change either. It's indicative of an external story-related factor, that of folklore. It technically aligns with the themes most games in the series cover of loss of self, yet the mode is different and it never ends up feeling like anything but a surface-level representation of a metaphor. Taken all together, the combat ends up being the single most defining feature of this game, and not in a good way. Silent Hill's strength has always been in the way it makes you feel powerless, awkward while facing its horrors. By contrast, combat here dominates the experience, bending the game around mechanics that often feel at odds with its atmosphere. The multiple systems you have to manage while fighting only help turn the combat into a stilted juggling act that never really develops in its own. Boss fights are loud and theatrical and never feel like something that's part of the series itself. Instead, their designs feel almost Souls-like, where they should be suffocating and dreadful. To me, they ended up feeling over the top, but ultimately fun. It features a variety of systems which the level designers never utilized to their fullest potential, like the durability system or the fairly clunky lock-on. And once the Fox arm appears, the game just seems to turn combat into button mashing. None of those systems are outright broken. They could easily work in another game built for fast-paced brawling, but here they feel, at least to me, tonally deaf. When the name on the box says Silent Hill, these choices can't help but feel like missteps, mechanics that belong elsewhere. And I feel like a similar number of problems also appear in the game from the things that I mentioned above, like the lack of exploration and puzzles, and even in some cases the lack of long-time series composer Akira Yamaoka. In a quite baffling choice, they employed the work of him only for the real-world environments. As for the Nightmare World and boss fights, they had separate composers do all of the music for those regions. The problem isn't really the fact these new compositions are bad, it's the fact there's only a singular track that's used for the ambience of the Nightmare World, one that's also used in most of the cutscenes and almost all emotional bits that happen there. And its problem is that it feels like extremely generic traditional Japanese music. It's also the only ambience you'll ever hear in the Nightmare world, and that alone to me makes the already samey looking area feel even more so. Where'd he go?
Exactly.
Did he just...
Precisely, Nelson. Precisely. Thank you, Nelson.
Nu-l pune! Deci nu pot să fac nimic efectiv. Yamaoka's actual compositions in this game do feel amazing here, and some of them have quickly become my favorites. Especially the battle music featuring the mechanical factory-like sounds the series is known for. It feels especially tense early on in the game, but because they're confined almost entirely to the real world, their impact gets diluted. And I feel like if he had had the chance to work on the Nightmare World variant, some of the moments in this game would have hit much harder. But there's a sense of unevenness portrayed to this choice. In particular, and the game operates on this uneven plane for multiple of its systems. Even outside systems themselves, it extends even to how the game runs. A quite harsh transition, I know, but I feel like we need to tackle the elephant in the room before moving on to the story analysis. The game is built on the infamously badly optimized Unreal Engine 5, and while nowadays the conception is that the engine itself isn't really the problem, I still believe a lot of the systems and the ways rendering is done in it result in these strange spikes. Shader compilation problems, hitches, fluctuating frame rates and odd stutters crop up far too often, even on a fairly powerful machine like my own. And the result is a game that feels choppy all throughout, no matter what graphic settings you really use. By the time this video might come out, this fact might be outdated due to the patches, but even then, releasing a game in this state in 2025 shouldn't really be in question. Another problem that arises is that the issue isn't even purely cosmetic. This series in particular relies so heavily on atmosphere and immersion provided by those fog effects, turning them down to lower settings reduces their density entirely, and I fail to see how the game really needs to render everything beyond the fog. For crying out loud, the first game in the series used the fog to hide the loading assets, and this game in 2025 can do it to save its life. Those sudden drops in performance cut straight through the tension and make the game feel severely choppy unless you implement any form of upscaling. A rather sad state to leave the game in. Problems stacked upon problems. What's there more left to talk about than the story? Well, shall we? A lot of it comes through Hinako's journal, a really nicely drawn and put together memoir that logs every single character, encounter and monster you find along the game. On paper, this is an extremely strong idea since it gives us direct access to see how Hinako herself thinks and what she sees in her surroundings. It's the perspective of a traumatized 16-year-old girl, so as such the way it's written must be indicative of that, and for the most part it is. It is well written in that regard. The very first entries already set the tone. After leaving home, Hinako writes about her father that he is the patriarchal father. A label which, while not inaccurate, shows how bluntly the journal approaches every idea. It feels as though something collapsed in translation. Either the Japanese original was pared down into literal English, or the author himself, Ryushiki07, deliberately wrote in a way that avoids nuance. The result is a text that opts for the most obvious phrase possible and literal meanings of what it's describing. I'm also heavily against just giving the players the descriptions explaining what the monsters represent, since that cuts back a ton of nuance and in my opinion stops the player from attaching their own interpretations of the designs, instead nullifying them and branding them underneath a singular meaning. Hinako also has moments in the journal where she says things like "I don't want to become this creepy monster" in relation to things like the physical manifestation of pregnancy. That lack of subtlety makes the entries feel simplistic and quite one-sided. Even then, this directness wouldn't necessarily be a problem if the journal used it to capture the fragmented obsessive tone of the trauma Hinako's going through. And sometimes it does, but more often it tilts into a kind of one-sided ideology and endless rhythm of man bad. In a story about the abuse of women, that makes sense, but more problems come from the fact some of the more extreme viewpoints are never challenged, and instead the player is meant to take them at face value. One monster in particular, meant to represent sexual assault, is described as not going for boys, and that being a typical characteristic of it, as though its lack of interest in them is the defining trait. I hate how the thought process is the fact it does not assault the other gender either. Family is undeniably one of the starting points for systemic oppression and abuse that women suffer, but here it's presented as the only cause, which oversimplifies a much more complex reality. Fathers and men in town are tyrants, pregnancy is treated like an outright curse, motherhood is shown to be a monstrous fate of misfortune, where the woman is subjugated to the most horrifying horrors of her life. Hinako's trauma explains why she would interpret her world this way, but the problem is that the game never interrogates it. It never pushes back, never adds texture, never challenges her perspective with another angle. It just piles resentment on resentment until the game inevitably ends. The game overall is more against abstract concepts than actually hating the crime portrayed, which is another one of its issues, as if having a family is the main causality in sexually or physically abusing others. This is a matter I just cannot completely agree with. I really dislike when the nuance isn't presented in a story tackling themes like this, because it's already quite a divisive topic, and the result of ignorantly using these themes just in passing like such is adding fuel to the fire that is culture war. I bet a lot of people will come out of this game with a twisted idea of what it's trying to portray, instead of understanding the fact women's abuse is systemic and perpetuated by a variety of factors which indeed do begin with the family, will try to frame it in a modern landscape and blame it on a singular easily pinpointed central theme, that of the man. Even with its blunt delivery, the journal ends up being the best representation of these themes in the game, unfortunately. The main story has all the subtlety of an egg sandwich, and I never really felt like anything was subtle. Everything is told outright with no nuance. It boils down to a handful of flat statements. Abusing women bad, arranged marriage bad, drugs bad. But it never digs into the roots of these problems. Instead, it reduces them to men being the constant perpetrators of this abuse, without examining the cultural or casual forces behind them, even less so than the journal itself. The storytelling suffers further from its structure. Pacing constantly breaks down with awkward stilted transitions into the nightmare world. Hinako faints at random and the plot finds increasingly absurd excuses to knock her out cold, dragging the story forward in the clumsiest way possible. The story structure is balanced between these two different worlds, the nightmare world and the real one, with the goal alternating between each of the switches. In the beginning, right after you get off the alley, your goal is to meet back up with your friends. After running a bit around and getting acquainted with the controls and systems, you end up back at the Chizuruya, where you find Sakuko's lifeless body covered in spores and plants. The game then forces you into a combat arena, and after the fight, without rhyme or reason, your character randomly faints and gets sent to the nightmare world. The nightmare world begins with a short puzzle where you match multiple objects on a pedestal before it makes a dark red force possess the hall you're in. You're forced to run, and upon knocking on the door, someone opens it. It appears to be a man with a fox mask. From here on out, the nightmare world is relegated to executing steps of a ritual that this fox mask character provides for you. All the while, the doll from your childhood makes appearances telling you not to trust him. You are, however, never really allowed to make any choices on your own, instead being locked into completing the ritual no matter if you agree or not. In the beginning, you must solve a puzzle involving a bunch of symbols in order to get a stone jade key and step onto hollow ground. At which point your character faints in the nightmare world and awakens with Shu by her side. They talk about the fact everyone from the town has disappeared and simply move on toward Rinko's house since they got separated during the chase with the fog monster. Before Hinako can reach Rinko's house, however, she passes through the Scarecrow field where the game places one of its most memorable puzzles. We have to recognize which ones of the scarecrow fit the description of the note by the students. Each time we complete one of these areas, we get a piece of an article reporting the drowning of a 5-year-old child in the rice fields. When we get the last piece, the child's name appears to have been scrubbed off and replaced with Hinako's own. Moments like these are where the game briefly shines and can almost feel like the previous games in the franchise. Walking through the empty town feels uncanny, and when the town isn't yet populated with a multitude of enemy types, instead focusing on building its atmosphere, it feels almost as if the world itself is straining to whisper at you, like the game is indeed back to its roots. These sequences, however, are very subtle and short, and they stand in sharp contrast to the rest of the experience. The game desperately needed more of these discomforting non-combat stretches to truly capture the essence of Silent Hill. Instead, what we got was not really any different from a run-of-the-mill horror game, and its lack of tension builds into the fact the game rarely manages to feel disturbing or frightening in the deeper psychological way that defined the original series. In a sense, the Scarecrow Field, the school, and a bunch more areas only highlight what the game could have been if it had leaned into mood and atmosphere rather than blunt storytelling or combat-oriented gameplay. After reaching Rinko's house, the group realizes that the bridge out of town has collapsed, making their escape impossible. Hinako is sent to the kitchen with Rinko in order to get a first aid kit, and on her descent down the stairs, the doll from her childhood appears. It warns Hinako once again, but this time about Rinko. The claim of the doll is confirmed when Rinko pushes Hinako down the stairs. The fall knocks her unconscious, and as with so many moments in the game, this becomes the excuse to drag her into the nightmare world once again. The overuse of fainting as a narrative device quickly becomes tiresome and feels like the lazy way out the writer chose in order to switch to exposition. It actively removes any sense of organic transition and makes the story feel artificially segmented. On this visit in the nightmare world, we are brought to the zone I mentioned above, at one point, the one that looks the most like the docks area in New Meniki. And as we move through the area, we find several notes describing the village's traditions, specifically its connections to Inari Okami, the fox deity most worshipped in the region. These texts outline wedding ceremonies that have been passed down through generations. There's also a set of paintings in one room where the life stages of a woman are showed from birth to marriage. The imagery is heavy-handed, foreshadowing the way marriage is framed as a woman's inevitable fate. At the same time, there are also ominous messages scrawled on the walls that heavily imply the fox's intentions are not benevolent. A point that will later become central to the game's metaphor. As the player explores the environment, Sakuko's voice begins to echo through the nightmare world, even though she has already been established as dead. This leads to a boss fight against her. During the encounter, she claims she has come to save Hinako, accusing her of betrayal multiple times. But because the player already knows Sakuko is dead, her return feels quite strange. Because there really isn't a plot reason for her fighting you. The only one I can remotely imagine is that because of her priestly background, she figured out you were being manipulated by the fox god and attempted to pull you out of the nightmare world by killing you. Still, that doesn't explain why she calls you a traitor. There's no tragedy to the encounter, no real emotions, because it is impossible to feel genuine loss for a character who just died 15 minutes earlier. And the problem with this is that they do it yet again with Sakuko, but we'll talk about that when we get there. The fox mask appears last minute in the fight and saves us from Sakuko, erasing her from existence, it seems. Afterwards, he invites Hinako to drink holy water as part of ritual cleansing of impurities, but the liquid suddenly turns to lava, burning her until she awakens in the real world. Yet again, the symbolic weight of this scene never lands, and the moment functions mostly as a perfunctory transition back to the other side in a story already mirrored in predictability. This story really likes doing the classic writing trick with meanwhile back at the ranch, in that it shifts perspective from each narrative thread trying to make it interesting, but it just never properly builds into that. You expect it to be something deeper, but it just doesn't achieve the proper depth. When we return to the real world, Rinko acts like nothing happened, and starts becoming progressively more annoying as time passes on. She begins acting out of jealousy here. She calls out Hinako for being manly or keeps nagging Shu and her about why they never got into a relationship. This attitude continues as they decide to head for the highway behind the school to escape the fog. And of course, as per usual, Shu and Rinko keep disappearing, so we have to make a beeline for the school objective marker on the map. By the time we arrive at the school, Rinko and Shu are discussing the fact that you're effectively dead, living in a quite different world. A conversation that will later serve as a metaphor for something quite obvious. The characters decide to trek through the forest only to discover that the school gate is locked, requiring you to find the key. And instead of just jumping the tiny fence, literally shorter than Shu, with no spikes or obstacles around it whatsoever, they decide to go inside and look for the key. It's just one of many little things which, again, bother me. Inside the school, Rinko continues to behave badly, pleading with Shu to stay with her while you search for the key. So you're forced to go through every room in the school in the hopes of finding a way to open the gate. During this exploration, you find letters between Shu and Rinko detailing her love for him, alongside a collection of resentful origamis from classmates addressed to Hinako, which all help show the fact that most of her classmates were envious of her. Even Rinko hated her because Shu gave her his undivided attention. At the end of the school section, after returning the keys, the characters suddenly demand that you go to sleep, and your character complies without explanation. I can't really expect much else from this, but once again, there's no reason for Hinako to go to sleep in the middle of the day in a school infested with monsters, even if her friends stood guard. It is an extremely lazy justification to force yet another trip to the nightmare world, which just helps strengthen my point that the story follows a repetitive rhythm, which never really feels like it's actually building towards anything. During this visit to the nightmare world, the game forces you into a quest where you must kill each of your friends one by one, Shu, Rinko, and even Sakuko, once more. And by this point, the writing feels absurd, and I hate how it also tries to make you feel guilty for killing characters you've already witnessed die twice. The game tries to elicit sympathy by showing Sakuko as lonely, talking only to her pet rabbit, but none of these build real emotional weight. The narrative doesn't progress, the stakes feel hollow, and the repeated deaths erase any possibility of forming attachment or momentum. The entire sequence of you killing your friends is a metaphor for maturing and moving on after your marriage. That's why the characters were talking earlier about you being dead. This isn't really a metaphor, even because Fox Mask immediately spells it out for you after the section is done. After this, you faint yet again. When Hinako awakes, her friends are gone and not a trace of them can be found. She assumes they've headed all the way up the mountain to Shu's house and decides to take it upon herself to climb up alone, in the hopes of meeting back with them up there. When arriving there, you get grabbed by a fox hand and thrown into the ground, yet again fainting and going into the nightmare world. Yet again without much rhyme or reason. This time, going through the environments, Hinako is subjugated to the ritual which gets her the fox arm. If you haven't realized by this point, this whole thing is a metaphor for marriage. The way the fox mask brands her and calls her his while slowly changing her appearance into one akin to his. This is easily predictable and quite basic plot points, as multiple environmental clues like magazines talk about the establishing of the traditional family, and almost all the enemy designs up until this point have been related to that as well. The fox represents your husband as part of an arranged marriage, the characters earlier having discussed your death because you were moving away with your new husband. Or to be more exact, getting spirited away into a marriage with the fox god. This is evidenced by the fact later on in the game you can find missing posters with your name on them. At the end of the ritual, you get to fight an angry and jealous Rinko. Again, the same problem arises where this moment has the emotional impact of a wet blanket and seems totally dissonant. Killing this character a second time in a row, it generally feels like they needed to split the game apart with boss fights. It couldn't think of anything more creative than fighting your friends. Most of the time, these sort of things just seem to happen in the story with no apparent reason. They don't even properly tie together the arcs they had established, and it ends up feeling like they're really hoping the metaphor of you saying goodbye to your friends and family when entering the marriage will pull most of the heavy lifting, which it doesn't. After the battle, Hinako faints again in the nightmare world, reawakening in the real one, and we get a cutscene of the phone calling inside Shou's house. We pick it up and it's Hinako's mom asking her to come home. From behind a corner, her sister appears and tells her it's time to decide her future before quickly disappearing. At this point, the game just devolves into throwing combat arena after combat arena, enemy after enemy at the player to impede progress. The design leans heavily on artificially inflating the difficulty and the runtime, even blocking your way multiple times unless you defeat these tanky, pregnant enemies, which keep spawning additional foes. This same scenario is repeated 3 times in a row, souring any little good taste you had left about the combat, and the pacing also suffers as the story's emotional beats are interrupted by combat that feels mechanically tedious and narratively hollow over and over again. Running back all the way to the house, we get stopped into a forced memory of previous events. At the park, Hinako remembers the day from her past. One day, a boy named Kotoyuki gets bitten by a fox. Hinako intervenes, helping him up and calming the animal. When the adults arrive, they most likely chase the fox away or kill it, and afterwards Hinako and Kotoyuki introduce themselves to each other. This scene exists purely to give a face to the fox mask, with the revelation that Kotoyuki is literally him being the focus of the memory. But as usual, this comes too late in the story for it to be even remotely meaningful from an emotional standpoint. Running back to the Hinako household, we get to explore the house and do a variety of puzzles. This section is also broken up by memories of the past, fights the parents had with Hinako that show she never wanted to get married in the first place. At the end of the main puzzle of the area, you end up meeting a secondary version of yourself which has entirely different goals from you. She wants you to grow up and get married, to stop depending on your parents. She's a very on-the-face representation of the dual nature of her character, each side being split between agreeing to the marriage and doing her own thing. The shadow Hinako tries to demoralize Hinako by telling her that everyone hates her before disappearing. Following this, the game forces a boss fight against her parents. During the encounter, they spout lines like "this is a woman's role in society" and "you must begin acting like one." The bluntness of this messaging exemplifies a recurring problem with the story, that while it explores psychological and societal themes, it does so without any subtlety, often spelling out the moral lessons it wants to transmit directly to the player instead of allowing them to emerge organically. The game's approach to gender norms and the treatment of women in 1960s Japan is present and thematically interesting, but the presentation is heavy-handed. Later boss encounters reinforce this point, with the characters loudly dictating how a woman should behave, stripping the narrative of nuance and undercutting the potential psychological depth even further. After the fight, Hinako faints yet again, gets sent to the nightmare world and gets properly engaged to Kotoyuki. There's also a quite unintentionally hilarious scene where the game plays the vine boom sound effect in a bizarrely dissonant scene. Deci a făcut vine boom sound effect. What? Returning to the real world, we're forced to pass through a lot more combat arenas and run around the town, only to run into a physical metaphor of you becoming a bride. She grabs us and Junko appears behind the corner urging her to kill you, and she complies. We get sent back to the nightmare world yet again, where we continue the wedding ritual until Hinako gets overtaken by red flowers. Now the real world is covered in blooms and we are in the fox form. After retracing steps back to Hinako's house and through even more combat arenas, confronting her parents once more, the game once again spells it out for you that the form you saw earlier was the version of you that is wedded. The game forces yet another nightmare sequence, which is full of combat arenas this time. And after running to the end of it, we find our sister, which tries to stop us, but Hinako takes the pills and makes her disappear. Some parts of this are similar to the other endings as well, but essentially the player destroys the wedding altar and fights the embodiment of the something in each one. In this case, we fight the bride, and at the end of the fight, Hinako is made to escape the dark shrine, running through a hallway full of pills as your father and husband scream at you in the background. Eventually we make it to an open area and the bride is there. Stuck in a stand-stop, you both scream at each other and the game just ends. This ending boils down to you overdosing on the red pills you've collected throughout the entire game, which were given to you and scattered by Shu at the start of the story. Shu gave Hinako the pills knowing very well they could kill her. Her friends knew about it, they hated her too. He was incredibly saddened by the fact Hinako was getting married. After she takes the pills, they make her go insane and she kills her father and husband, Kotoyuki, and then runs away, probably dying later on. We get a police report mention the fact the reason she had gone insane was because of the pills, and the game ends abruptly. This ending essentially hinges on the red pills being introduced at the start of the game and only being revealed to be poisoned much later, making this entire thing completely unavoidable on a first time playthrough. The game even has the audacity to put them in your inventory when you're on 1 HP and pop up a tutorial box explaining to you how to use healing items. Even if the player ignores them initially, the game manipulates item spawns to ensure repeated exposure, essentially coercing players into taking the pills to progress. The game actively punishes you for using its survival horror mechanics because of that. While in tune with the game's themes, it lying to you and forcing you into the bad ending first just to make you play again feels incredibly unfun, and it feels like this choice was made specifically to artificially inflate playtime, particularly given the steep €80 price tag the game has. Entering New Game Plus, there's quite a few changes to the cutscenes overall, like the fact that Doll in the beginning talks about the woman's job being to get married when she grows up, or that most references to death shown during the first playthrough are altered to be references to marriage. These never go past surface level and they're not really worth specifically pointing out. You also get the Fox arm much earlier in order to ease the combat and skip some pretty long combat arenas you had to do to gain it. Apart from that, all of the remaining New Game Plus endings, excluding the UFO joke ending, which every single game in the series has had, feels like a bad ending of sorts. The Fox ending is one of the first ones you can do by simply not consuming any red pills, finding and purifying a sacred sword by doing a game-spanning mission, or by simply never finding it and obtaining the Agura no Hotei-sama. In this ending, Shu reflects on his mistake and eventually turns into a monster Hinako has to fight. The monster represents his jealousy and wish to break Kotoyuki and Hinako apart. After the fight, both Kotoyuki and Shu put their differences aside, but still end up treating her like an object, and agree they are the only ones who truly understand her. Sho sort of gets cocked and they have a fist bump before a light rain starts, a sign of a good wedding. It's strange because even though Hinako's choice in this ending is to get married to Kotoyuki, it's still treated by the end like it was outside her control. And to add salt to the wound, Kotoyuki acts uncharacteristically, ignoring Hinako's feelings entirely when the whole game he has appeared to be attentive to her. The scene shifts to the future where we see Hinako as a traditional bride, and as everything appears to be okay, we learn that she is actually trapped here. She screams she doesn't want to be like her mother, and the game once again abruptly ends. In the additional New Game Plus ending, while she's fighting the representation of her traditional role of the bride, Kotoyuki shows up and doesn't believe her to be the real Hinako, because she disobeys him. Sho also shows up earlier and knocks him out while he's distracted looking at the doll from Hinako's childhood, which appears here for some reason yet again. Hinako and Sho then try to run away, but are forced into a fight with Kotoyuki. The point of this fight, as Kotoyuki puts it, is for Hinako to step properly into his world, forgetting the real one. In time, the missing poster will crumble away in the wind, he says. Additional dialogue in this scene is again unsubtle and sadly devolves into the characters just screaming their emotions mid-fight. You mean to say a woman's happiness is not to be given a man's love? My happiness is something I decide. It's not something given to me by anyone else. After defeating Kotoyuki, Hinako thanks him for everything. Shu shows up and Kotoyuki tells her he can settle matters on his own and urges them to go. In this ending, both Shu and Hinako escape, Shu says she did it all on her own, while Hinako thanks him for helping her. They run away from the camera laughing, but the scene shifts at the last minute to a radio saying that there's hydrogen sulfide in their town, and as a result, both of them are most likely dead. None of these endings are satisfying. They feel disjointed, contradictory, and in some cases outright ridiculous. The game pushes the player relentlessly towards the so-called true ending, while the others collapse into unsatisfying dead ends that undermine any sense of achievement the game may have tried to provide. Worse still, the design artificially pads out the experience, since it expects the player to replay the game 4 or 5 times just to reach the real conclusion. By the second run, the repetition already feels exhausting, and instead of feeling like the game is moving somewhere, it ends up feeling shallow. In order to get the true ending, you need to complete the game 2 times already. The third time around, you can finally get it by not using pills, obtaining the sword and purifying it, and sacrificing an amulet right before the parents' house. In this true ending, Hinako shows up, and after speaking to Junko, she realizes someone's been messing with all of them. Says one person wants to marry her and the other wants to stop the wedding. She's of course referring to Kotoyuki and Shu. They've been pitted against each other. Everyone is always pressuring us, rushing us, forcing us. Hinako starts talking to herself, apologizing to her family, and says that if they wanted her to truly be happy, they would leave her alone. She destroys the wedding altar, and her other self from the nightmare world shows up and wonders why they should fight if only one of them will survive. They magnetize together with their hand clutched to each other's necks as the silhouettes behind them become Shu's and Kotoyuki's monster forms. The scene fades and Kotoyuki gives exposition that once in a while humankind produces a girl who is blessed with divine power, and upon her birth a spell is placed upon her for the fox god to go ahead and look for her and marry her, implanted by his ancestors, and gods to look for a bride. The god calls him a fool, laughing at Kotoyuki. Finally, Hinako fights the gods in alternating forms, switching between Kotoyuki and Shu fights, although none of them are present this time around. It's just the fox god and the doll. Slaying the gods drops the doll to the ground. The god angers. Kotoyuki tries to save both Hinakos, moving them into the hall, and says he wishes to know if his love for them is truly real. Kotoyuki embraces Hinako and takes her outside the nightmare world. At the end of the game, you receive a letter from Kotoyuki saying he wants to live life to the fullest and then re-evaluate his feelings for Hinako. Both Hinakos now exist. They wonder what they should do about their future. Hinako wishes to live a life full of passion and fill her heart with things she loves. One wants to propose to Kotoyuki when she gets the chance, and the other wishes to find her own thing to fill her heart. They realize no one will ever tell them what to do. Just the two of them remain in town.
ものすごく努力して情熱のすべてを注ぎ込むような一途で一生懸命な生き方をしてみたい。今度は私から琴幸さんに求婚するくらいの勢いで一生懸命に。私はまだ決まってないけど、とにかく何かに一生懸命に。何それここは静かだね。誰も邪魔しない、せかさない。いるのは私たちだけ。私たちだけで行く末を決められる。こんな静かな恵比寿ヶ丘は初めてかも。ここは私たち
The game ends with them noticing that Ebisugoka is now silent. Their silent Ebisugoka. Their silent hill. Even in the so-called true ending, the game never reaches a conclusion that feels earned. It tries to split the two Hinakos, the rebellious one and the acceptant one, leaving Hinako with both possibilities. She can marry Kotoyuki someday, or she can find her own passions, and both Hinakos will somehow just coexist. What should have been a definitive stand against her destiny for Hinako to me simply feels like an inability to make a choice, ending up as the game's overarching message. It's neither empowering nor necessarily a rejection of tradition. It's a middle ground between them that, to be frank, feels unearned. And then to cap it off, the game sinks into Marvel tier dialogue, handing the player the groany wordy "Our Silent Ebisugoka," almost like saying "Our Silent Hill" at the end, acting like it said something profound. It isn't profound. It lands like the rest of the endings, self-contradictory and unsatisfying. At the end of the day, Silent Hill F's narrative ambitions collapse under their own weight. It wants to be a story about freedom, about breaking from cycles of tradition and expectations, but it never dares to commit to any one stance. Marriage is both inevitable and rejected, and the individual choice is both celebrated and smothered at the same time. The game wants to be empowering but constantly undercuts Hinako's own agency. That's why none of these endings resonate, not because the premise is uninteresting, but because the execution is rather confused. By forcing the players to replay the same hollow bits again and again, the game acts as if there's meaning to be uncovered, but when you finally reach the core, there's nothing there but a shrug and a hollow answer. I never went into this game wanting to hate it, and by the end of it I still didn't. What I played of it I enjoyed, but I never felt like this was a Silent Hill game. That's the tragedy of Silent Hill F. It had the chance to be a modern reimagining of the series' psychological core, a new Silent Hill talked about for ages to come. Instead, all of its systems felt like they belonged in a different game entirely. All that remains is a sad attempt to recapture the feelings of the long-gone town, of the past in ruin, of trying to show people the abuse and sorrow a person goes through. Mishandled and unfortunately too blunt for its own good. Maybe someday, but not today, we'll get to see, in our restless dreams, that town, the town of Silent Hill, yet again.